This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is gardener and activist Ed Allnutt. Ed is part of Plastics Rebellion and the Plastics Crisis Instagram account, and campaigns to reduce the use of plastics, particularly in a gardening context. We talk about the most common offending items in the gardening world and discuss possible solutions to the current accepted ways of gardening, so we can make changes that better the environment.
At the moment, I work as a gardener. I also campaign around the issue of plastics, which I guess I'll probably talk about at some point. I think, like a lot of gardeners, I didn't come to it through a traditional route. I was essentially going into research and teaching and around medievalism, and I just felt that kind of call to work outside and to change my career to be working outdoors. So began to do volunteering in green spaces, become very active in like parks and stuff like that, and became a gardener that way. Ended up really enjoying self-employment and that kind of thing. And I would say I tend towards wildlife gardening specifically.
Excellent. Our kind of people. So where are you based? Are you in the southeast?
Yeah, I'm in London and I work around North and occasionally a bit of South London for a couple of small companies and also for myself.
So you mentioned plastics, and yes, I would very much like to talk to you about plastics. How did you get into that as a kind of area that you decided you wanted to look into? Was it just because you went into gardening and thought, ooh, hang on a minute, this is meant to be green and we're not doing that well?
I was living in Clapham for a couple of years in South London. And there was a local development plan kind of spearheaded by the council to put essentially like a kind of putting green, but an astroturf one onto part of Clapham Common. So I basically kind of spearheaded a campaign with local residents to stop them from doing that. And in the process of doing so, I learned a huge amount about astroturf and I ended up coming into contact with a kind of grassroots, that's not a pun actually in this case, but campaign called, at the time called Plastics Rebellion, who came out of Extinction Rebellion, who were doing a lot of stuff about plastics. And so we began to do stuff together and began to move into a new identity where we call ourselves Truth About Plastic now. And we campaign generally. Our most recent project is talking about the Global Plastics Treaty and trying to make people very aware of what's at stake when it comes to global plastics regulation.
Can you explain what that is, if for anyone that's not heard of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Global Plastics Treaty is a treaty that has been brought about by the UN Environmental Programme. And the final round of negotiations for it is going to be at the end of this year in November, assuming that they can come to some kind of agreement then. It's the biggest chance we have for like worldwide regulation of plastics through some kind of international law. And that could be really high ambition. It could be like a cap on the amount that we actually produce globally in the whole world. Or it could be countries agreeing to schemes like extended producer responsibility, which is where producers have responsibility for what they've produced and increased recycling and things like that. So there's a kind of high ambition version and a low ambition version. And our recent campaigning has been to get organizations to sign a letter, which we host online at ink-letter.com, asking for the high ambition version of that. If you think about the problem with plastics is essentially one of quantity. We have too much of it in the world. What we have to do is turn off the tap and stop producing at a certain point. If we don't, because plastics are cheap commodity and they're made easily with oil and gas and they're really useful, we will keep producing and we will keep polluting until such a point as, well, it's already highly unmanageable, but it will only get worse and worse. So the High Ambition Treaty says we set a global baseline, what we're currently producing, and then we reduce down from that gradually. And sadly, at the moment, we're failing because those talks are being co-opted by oil and gas lobbyists who are just as interested in plastics as they are in primary oil and gas. And they're really going to, along with the fact that countries are finding it hard to agree because many countries are big oil and gas producers, we may not be at the moment on target for getting that kind of global plastics treaty that really puts a cap on plastics production.
So that's the top-down change. If you didn't see the results that you wanted, are there things that people can do as consumers, as individuals, to put pressure on these companies as well at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that a lot of environmental movements have that phrase that you've probably heard, which is like system change, not individual change. And I think that one of the most powerful things that citizens can do is to come together to advocate for system change. Because unfortunately, we do live in quite a top-down world. It's all very well sorting out my recycling into the appropriate containers, but what if recycling is actually part of the problem? Because it really is something that enables more and more production of plastic. I mean, that's one kind of typical consumer end strategy, is increase the amount of recycling you do. But every time you recycle a plastic item, you lose a certain amount of it through microplastics into the environment and through what has degraded over time. So recycling is always introducing more new plastic into the whole system. Hence, we don't turn off the tap. Now, that is not to say that we can't do things. And I think just within the context of this podcast, which is, I guess, about environment and nature, particularly within my industry, which is gardening, I think there is so many places in which we can really advocate for greater change in the way that we go about our work and the way that we design as well.
So you mentioned obviously plastic grass, and that is a big demonised product that gets used in gardening by certain sectors of the gardening world anyway. In your opinion, is that the biggest problem that we're facing at the moment, or are there many different ones?
There are lots of different ones. I wouldn't want to separate them or put numbers on any of them. I think the thing about plastic grass is it is so obviously bad for the environment and completely wasteful in its life cycle and completely rubbish for nature. It just provides no benefits and provides lots of negatives. It should be so clear to us that it shouldn't be part of our landscaping repertoire. Because first of all, the material, once it's been used, it doesn't have any good kind of end of life scenarios. They're only now learning how to recycle it. There's a massive backlog of it. There are fields of the stuff I've seen piled up in England and also in the USA. In Europe, there's a horrible kind of traffic amongst recyclers who just can't recycle it fast enough. So it's a big waste problem. It creates a dead zone for nature because when you install it, if you've ever seen an installation, you're normally digging quite a way down towards the subsoil. You're scraping all of that, placing aggregate, placing membranes, and then placing the turf on top of sand as well. So you're basically just removing great tracts of soil, and then you're putting on this material which increases urban heat island effect. It makes things warm up. It can often cause hydrological problems like water problems. And it does nothing for nature. Nothing can use it. Even with kind of football pitches that are highly treated with things like herbicides, they still have a soil. You've still basically got worms and many of the kind of subsoil creatures living down there. So yeah, that is a big problem. But I mean, if you were to look into the garden, just look into any garden that and have a little think about the different plastic products that we put into there or the bits of plastic that go into it. I mean, first of all, there's continual planting of new plants from nurseries with plastic plant pots. That's a huge area of concern. What about something like resin bonded gravel? This is essentially a gravel that's glued together with polyurethane. What about also crumb rubber and crumb bark that are often used, like the kind of fake plastic bark that we often see? There are all kinds of plasticizer in many building materials, and there's a lot of plastic in our tools and things like membranes as well. And of course, tools shed plastic too. The really simple example being like the strimmer, where you're always shedding kind of nanoplastics from the wire as it gradually breaks up in the environment. But there are so many places in which we are continually adding to the toxic load of plastics and chemicals present in the soil, little by little, just more and more. And I think that's something we can change. We can change it in our industry. And that means a very different way of approaching how we source plants. For example, could we localize nurseries more so that we're using less plastic to move plants around and to pot on? grow more plants in the ground, grow from seed, grow more from 9 centimetre pots than from larger pots. I mean, that gives a higher failure rate, so that might be problematic as well. But all of these are options that we can continue to explore with.
That is the word for a lot of people, problematic, that they are operating a business and they're operating within the parameters of the industry. And I'm always very anti-top-down change because I'm very cynical and I think, well, as you say, there's vested interests. It takes a lot to change things. So I'm very keen on the individual taking the lead as well. But when you're running a business and you're dealing with customers and they're saying, well, I don't want to buy the plants from that nursery because they're X amount more, or, you know, I don't want you to do that job manually with tools with a metal blade and a wooden handle. I want you to use a strimmer because it takes twice as long with the metal blade. There are sort of practical considerations for people trying to run businesses profitably. What advice could you give people like that in that instance?
I would love to give people advice, believe me. I really would. And it would be so inappropriate for me to do so. I try to do my best within what I do, and I'm totally imperfect in that too. I buy plastic pots at nurseries. I use the tools that you've mentioned. I think something we need to see, and I don't put this as a kind of like everybody must do this, but as a kind of a wish and a hope and an aspiration, is that especially as not only gardeners, but other kind of land managers, we can think about putting our time when we have it into community projects where we can, because there are a lot of places where I think we could save so much waste if gardeners and landscape managers of various kinds were using their skills in communities. And, you know, okay, this is something that I do actually do. So maybe I can give this as a little bit of advice, but it's just, for example, having community compost schemes, setting those up, it's going to save so many miles and plastic bags on compost and reduce the kind of the need for heat treatment by councils. If we were able to have community-led nurseries, if we could get tracts of land for that, it could not only become something that's quite profitable, but really reduce the amount of waste from moving plants all around the world. So I think that some of it might also be just that kind of continual taking an increased interest in our own surroundings and in local community projects and giving expertise to them. Because something I always see within friends of groups in parks and sometimes like kind of conservationist things too, is that there's loads of will for people to go and do something, but what's often lacking is like the expert plants person or the expert ecologist. You know, I was just talking to a good friend of mine earlier today who is really concerned about trees being knocked down along a section of railway track where she lives in North London. And one of the things that she always really needs is people who actually know trees, people who know bats, to give her advice on how to do that. So, I mean, this doesn't all relate to plastic, although some of it does. But I guess the encouragement would be like, if you have skills and you can give them to local community projects that are nature-centered, then you are so valued and needed there. That's such an important thing for us to do, I think, especially in time of climate crisis.
I was speaking to a friend today about this and she said, okay, well, we could replace plastic watering cans with metal ones, but the metal stuff is much heavier. If you've got issues around lifting, that could become a problem. So I suppose if there is that community involvement, if one person can't do a job, then what you'd like to think is that the other person who could do that job steps in. So I suppose it does translate across on a practical level. But she did have a valid point, I suppose, which is again about water storage. And that is tricky, I think, especially as we're trying to harvest rainwater and reduce the pressure on mains water. Can you see sort of any workarounds for that?
That's such a huge question. And I think that the thing that I point people towards on that is a lot of the work that people do in permaculture, not because they necessarily have solutions, but one of the things that David Holmgren says in his great book on permaculture, which is like a very big fat book about how we can live in a time of energy decline, is to say that whilst we have all of this oil and gas wealth, one of the things we absolutely have to do with it and really, really should concentrate on is building hydrological structures that will serve us for the future, whether that's building dams to dam water, building reservoirs and structures that will save rainwater. So there are some issues there. But I would also argue that if you're going to use lots of plastics, Using them for infrastructure projects where they're really needed is a very good place to use them. It's much better than using them, say, for plant pots, a lot of which are for plants which have a mainly ornamental value. And I say this as someone who uses them in people's gardens and don't contribute that much to ecology. That's arguably a less useful use than to conserve water in water butts and things like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And on the point of pots, you see these taupe coloured pots now in places that are, I think, made from recycled material, also recyclable. I'm not sure actually about the entire process behind it, but it's very difficult sometimes to actually know exactly what you're buying and exactly what you can do with it afterwards in terms of recycling it. And it's sometimes very, very tricky to find out about the provenance of a product and to find out if it's sustainable. Can you give any tips on that? I know people even in the industry, if they're very involved in it, struggle with that.
Plant pots is not an area of expertise for me. However, there are some things I do know. And one of them is you often hear that thing that black plant pots can't be recycled. I believe that is true because a kind of infrared light is used to sort plant pots in the recycling centre and it just can't detect black. So why do people make black plant pots? You might ask. Sensible question, right, to that. But the reason that they are made is because black as a color in plastics can cover up a lot of imperfections. So once you've recycled materials a few times and you have different colors and different things in there, the black will cover all of that up. And so maybe if you've got a black pot, you're looking at something that has been recycled a few times, but is now at the end of its recycling journey. And that is the thing that I would absolutely like for anybody who hasn't looked into recycling that much. The thing to really stress about the idea of recycling is it's always downcycling. You know, plastics degrade under UV and light, as we know, if you leave a plant pot out and it becomes all brittle and weird right in the sunshine. Plastics continually degrade. So the idea that you can recycle something in a circular manner, if it's these kinds of plastics, it's totally impossible. The best we can do is some damage limitation. But as long as we keep producing more and more of them, you're going to get more and more. So I'm really sorry. That's actually not any useful consumer advice for anybody listening. I wish I could give some, but the best advice is minimize your plastic pot use as much as you can. And I know that's very hard to do.
It's a very, very tricky subject. I think we're at the point where we know we need to make change, but we need more people to come up with the actual answers and point us in the right direction, definitely. I read a very scary book called A Year of No Garbage, and as the title suggests, it's American, but I think the state of affairs is fairly similar in Europe, and the recycling that she detailed was scary. I mean, there didn't seem to be any true recycling. It was just the lesser of a couple of evils. But you also mentioned, obviously, as things degrade, they break down. Is there an issue for the plastics getting into the soil? Is it an issue for soil health? Is it an issue for food crops? You know, what's the problem with all these microplastics getting into the soil?
Okay, so it is a massive issue. And the reason is partly the plastics themselves, right? The polymer, which is the product that's been created from oil and gas, but it's also the additives that are used with those plastics. One of the biggest groups of concern is a group of chemicals called PFAS, which are perfluoroalkyls, and there are more than 12,000 of these chemicals in total as a kind of chemical group. This is important because they're really hard to regulate. And those chemicals are used in order to do things like prevent sticking during molding and also to give things waterproofing qualities. So something like your raincoat almost certainly has a lot of PFAS in it to give it that kind of shiny waterproof quality. Those kinds of chemicals. Now, I don't specifically know about PFAS in plant pots, but they are certainly in many, many products. I wouldn't be surprised if they are. They are certainly in many products that we see in gardens, not least AstroTurf and membranes, geotextile membranes. But the issue with PFAS is that they are a very large group, many of which are quite known to be dangerous, many of which we don't yet really know what the effects of them are on human health. But they are endocrine disruptors and therefore may well be things that are potentially carcinogenic and lead to other diseases. What is happening in the world in general is that we're seeing this ever increasing toxic load of chemicals like PFAS in all areas of the environment. So in the soil, in the waterways. In Ohio, there have been absolutely huge class action lawsuits against one of the biggest manufacturers of PFAS, DuPont 3M. And that is essentially because waterways became extremely polluted with them, and people are claiming that they're very prone to various diseases now. So in general, I mean, this is probably not happening to that extent in your back garden, but with every fragment of plastic, we are increasing that toxic load in our soils. And after all, our soils, as they're continually recycled, are what we eat, and they're what we grow our plants in our garden as well. And once they're there, the final thing to say about PFAS really is they're forever chemicals. That's actually their nickname, which is to say that they don't break down, or they take absolutely ages to break down. So once they're there as that toxic load, they're there. And the same thing happens in your body. They bioaccumulate, meaning that the amount that you have is going to continually increase through your lifetime. So if there are health risks, we'll see them getting worse over the next 100 years. Maybe that's enough to frighten people into being very careful about, not leaving plant pots and plastic in the soil.
Yeah, God, I didn't even think about the clothing. I mean, I think that's why it's so important for, your work, because you're just flagging this stuff up. And even if people have heard it before and then it just gets slightly overlooked, just keep going. Hang on a minute, we need to stop doing this. We need to find better ways. So thank you for what you're doing. If people want to find out any more, have you got any way you'd like to direct them to?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have a look at our socials. So we're at Plastics Crisis and plastics.crisis on socials. We're just redoing our website at the moment as Truth About Plastic. If you want to understand a little about the Global Plastics Treaty, then you can have a look at the letter signed by many organisations, including the UN Assembly on Climate and Oceans, Greenpeace, Whale and Dolphin Conservation, all kinds of orgs, at our website, which is incletter.com, inc-letter.com. That's our most recent bit of work.
Thank you very much to Ed for highlighting this urgently pressing topic and for the work he does to make positive changes. Thanks to you as well for listening. If you like this interview, I recommend checking out episode 166, Waterwise Gardening with Janet Manning, and episode 49, Running a Green Nursery. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.